In the first lecture, we explored Foucault's theoretical framework, how the Greeks understood sexual ethics not as a system of prohibitions but as a stylization of freedom. Now, we will see how this framework was applied to three concrete domains of practice: dietetics, how to manage the body and health; economics, how to manage the household and marriage; erotics, how to manage relationships with boys. Each domain developed its own forms of moderation and self mastery, creating what Foucault calls an aesthetics of existence. First, dietetics, the relation to the body. For the Greeks, dietetics was not just about eating healthy food, it was a whole art of living, a way of managing one's existence in relation to nature. The regimen, diete, covered everything: exercise, food, drink, sleep, and sexual activity. It required constant attention to the body and its environment. The basic principle was measure. You had to find the right balance between too much and too little. But this was not a fixed rule, it depended on circumstances. The same act might be good in winter and bad in summer, good for a young person and bad for an old person. In this framework, sexual activity required careful regulation. The Greeks did not focus on types of sexual acts, what was permitted or forbidden, but on the quantity and circumstances of the activity. Should one have sex? How often? In what season? The Hippocratic writers recommended more sexual activity in winter and less in summer. The logic was based on qualities. Sex warms and moistens the body, so it should be used to counter cold and dryness. This was a qualitative economy, adjusting the body's equilibrium in relation to the environment. Why all this concern? The Greeks worried about sexual activity for three reasons. First, violence of the act. The sexual act was seen as violent, almost like a brief epileptic seizure. It was a force that could overwhelm reason and self control. Second, expenditure of vital substance. Semen was considered a precious substance drawn from the whole body. Each sexual act depleted the individual's vital energy. Excessive sex could cause illness, weakness, and even death. Third, death and immortality. The sexual act was at the junction of individual death and species survival. Humans have sex to reproduce because individuals die. It is nature's way of cheating death. This made the act both necessary and dangerous. What is striking is that this dietetics was not about eliminating sexual activity or treating it as evil, it was about using it wisely. The goal was to form oneself as a person who could control one's violence, conserve one's energy, and accept one's mortality while providing for descendants. The regimen of pleasures was an exercise of existence, a way of shaping oneself as an ethical subject. The second is economics, the relation to one's wife. The Greeks had a famous saying: mistresses we keep for pleasure, concubines for daily care, wives to bear legitimate children. This seems to suggest that marriage had nothing to do with sexual pleasure. But Foucault argues this is too simple. Marriage did raise moral questions, especially about how husbands should behave. The apparent paradox is this: Greek society accepted that married men could have sexual relations outside marriage. Yet, some moralists still said husbands should be moderate. Xenophon's Oikonomicus gives us the fullest picture of the Greek marital ideal. It is a manual for household management, how to run a farm, manage servants, and most importantly, how to treat one's wife. The key is that the wife is a partner, synergos, in the household economy. Her job is indoors, preserving, storing, and distributing what the husband brings from outside. His job is outdoors, producing, acquiring, and defending. Nature designed them for these complementary roles. But the wife is young and inexperienced, often married at 15 to a man twice her age. So the husband must train and guide her. He must make her a worthy partner, not by commanding her like a slave, but by teaching her to manage the household well. What does moderation mean for the husband? Foucault emphasizes that it is not sexual fidelity as we understand it. The husband is not expected to have sex only with his wife, rather, he is expected to maintain his wife's status. She should be first among the women in the household. Second, protect her privileges. She should not be replaced or humiliated. Third, keep her preeminent. Even as she ages, she should remain the honored mistress. The husband's moderation is a matter of justice. Give each person what they deserve according to their status. It is an ethics of power, not an ethics of fidelity. The wife's virtue comes from her dependence. She must obey because she is under her husband's authority. But the husband's virtue comes from his self mastery. He must restrain himself because he has the power to do otherwise. The same behavior, sexual moderation, has different meanings for each partner. The Greeks did not yet have the Christian ideal of mutual reciprocal fidelity based on a personal bond between spouses. Third is Eroticus, the relation to boys. The love of boys was common and accepted in Greece, but it was also a source of intense moral concern. This seems paradoxical. Why worry so much about something that was permitted? Foucault argues we must avoid the modern category of homosexuality. The Greeks did not see two different desires, hetero and homo. They saw one appetite for beautiful beings, whether male or female. What mattered was not the sex of the beloved, but the role one played in the relationship. Here is the central problem. A boy could be an object of pleasure. It was perfectly acceptable for a man to desire and enjoy a boy, but the boy must become a man, a free citizen who rules himself and others. He cannot identify with the passive subordinate role of pleasure object. This creates tension. The boy is expected to refuse, resist, and escape. If he yields, it must be out of kindness, not because he shares the pleasure. The boy should not experience physical pleasure. He should only be pleased to give pleasure to his lover. The boy's conduct was a matter of great social concern. He was watched, talked about, and judged. His honor, eidos, was fragile. He had to not yield too easily, that would show weakness and eagerness. Not yield to just anyone, he must be selective and dignified. Not yield for money, that would be prostitution. Yield only to a worthy man, someone who could offer friendship, education, and future status. The relationship was meant to transform into friendship, philia, a lasting bond based on mutual respect, not physical pleasure. This was the honorable outcome. The Greek anxiety was not about the desire of the lover. Why does a man desire a boy? But about the status of the beloved. How can a future citizen be an object of pleasure? This is the opposite of modern concerns. We worry about the subject's desire. The Greeks worried about the object's honor. Plato transforms the traditional erotics. Instead of asking to whom should the boy yield, he asks what is the nature of love itself. This shifts the whole problem. Foucault identifies four displacements. First, from behavior to nature. Instead of focusing on conduct, Plato asks about love's essence. Love is a desire for truth, not just a desire for beautiful bodies. Second, from honor to truth. The boy's honor is no longer the central concern. What matters is whether love leads toward true being. 3. From dissymmetry to convergence. Both lover and beloved are moved by the same eros toward truth. The boy becomes a lover too. Fourth, from the boy's virtue to the master's wisdom. The true guide is the philosopher who masters himself and teaches the boy to love truth. Platonic erotics introduces elements that would later transform sexual ethics entirely. The struggle with oneself becomes a spiritual combat. Renunciation becomes a path to truth. The question of desire, not just pleasure, becomes central. This ground is broken for the later Christian hermeneutics of desire, the project of deciphering hidden desires in the soul. Foucault identifies three major shifts in the history of sexual ethics. First, from boys to women, the focus of moral concern moves from male love relationships to marriage and female virginity. Second, from women to the body. Later, the focus shifts to children's sexuality and the question of normality and health. Third is unification. The different arts, dietetics, economics, erotics, become unified around the decipherment of desire and the purification of the self. This is how the Greek ethics of pleasure and aesthetics of existence, focused on stylizing freedom, becomes the Christian morality of the flesh, a codification of acts and a hermeneutics of desire. Foucault's great insight is that sexual ethics was not tolerant or free in any simple sense. It had its own forms of austerity, its own demands for self mastery. But these demands were organized differently. The Greeks were concerned with how to use pleasure well, not how to eliminate desire, how to master oneself, not how to decipher one's hidden desires, how to make one's life a beautiful work, not how to obey universal rules. Understanding this difference helps us see that our own moral categories are not eternal. They have a history, and by studying that history, we can begin to think differently about who we are and what we might become.